Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the jetpack refueled of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka post-black bands now required to submit a land acknowledgement for the DSBM territory that they have colonized for so many years. They should have to fucking do it, man.
You're living on Nictalgia land, pal.
The lands that Total Self-Hatred stewarded for us for so many years. Yeah.
That's true. DSBM had no concept of land ownership. It was actually post-Black that sort of, with its artificial conceptions of private property, post-Black moved in and sort of moved in and broke off pieces of the DSBM collective.
Post-Black moved into a DSBM neighborhood, gentrified it, and then called the cops saying, sir, I think the man in the apartment next to me might be cutting himself.
God damn, that's a good joke. The joke came to me at the same time, and I was just hoping you had it. I was like, is this where he's going with it? Good. Okay. And I am the black metal guy, a.k.a. watching only the sad first 2 minutes of animal adoption videos on the dodo in order to get in character for my, in order to practice my cry voice for a series of exhaustive Kingsfield lore videos.
I was actually watching a big Kingsfield retrospective the other day. Those games are...
they're so human.
They're interesting, but boy, they look like shit to play. Man, I've been actually fucking around with a lot of like sort of into mid-90s games lately. Mm-hmm. And there's some gems, but boy, the if anyone's going to argue that basic UI and game design principles haven't improved over the last 30 years, they're fucking lying to you. Anyway, we've been talking about video games. This is actually a show about heavy metal, or so we've been told by our NSA handlers. This is our final regular episode of the year. Boys, we have made it to the end of 2023, which means that there is only one big Terminus event left. And you guys know what it is. It is the Terminus Omega end-of-year episode where myself and the black metal guy will argue over our personal and perhaps combined top 20 lists of the year. But in keeping with some changes that we've made on the show, this year we're going to be doing it as a live stream. Yes, you heard it, folks. The first ever Terminus Omega live stream will be happening next week, December 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, that is December 27th, next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We will post in the Discord and post on our social media to remind you of that, but definitely if you guys are interested, feel free to jump in onto the stream for whatever time you can, or see if you can rough it with your favorite boys for the whole 38-hour process that it's probably gonna be. So, we're looking forward to this one. It should be a lot of fun. Have you started?
I have to take a shot every time I say riff.
Oh God, poor guy. We won't even get to the list. Actually, before we started recording, we were just talking about how nightmarish the process of making our lists is going to be this year. Because do you think this is the best in terms of like average record quality that we've ever had on the show for a year?
For sure. Yeah.
This is a really good year.
It's there has been a lot going on in terms of the in terms of the basic the genres and sort of trends we've been tracking on the show. And I think just we talked about it before, but it seems like there's a bumper crop in part because a bunch of records were delayed.
Yeah. It's definitely going to be tricky, but yeah, guys, jump into the live stream. Be sure to congratulate us or heckle us for our various choices. There's gonna be laughs, there's gonna be tears, and by the end of it, I think we'll all learn something about extreme metal. And the appropriate amount of blast beats per record. If you guys want some extra special reminders of what's coming up, well, the best way to do that is to follow us on social media. You can follow me, the Death Metal Guy, on Facebook at Terminus Podcast, or the Black Metal Guy on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal, where we will once again have the reminder posts for that live stream as it comes up next week. And for those who are particularly dedicated, for only the true and only the strong, you can subscribe to us on Patreon. $3 and up gets you access to our old lineup of bonus episodes, and $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, where we can post memes, talk about our favorite records, give each other life advice, and anticipate the release of Fish Tank Season 2.
Hail! This is Brandon from Cromlech, and you're listening to Terminus.
First up tonight, ladies and gentlemen, another triumphant return in a year that has been pretty great for triumphant returns in general. 8 years past the last full length, we have the return of Demoncy with Black Star Gnosis, out now on Dark Descent Records. This came out earlier this month. This is Demoncy's follow-up after 2015's Empire of the Fallen Angel Eternal Black Dominion, which was a very cool record, because pretty much everything that Demoncy does is really, really cool. This is going to be a slightly challenging review for me because I am hideously biased toward all things Demoncy and, in general, all things in this old-school U.S. Black Death circle. We covered the new Profanatica earlier this year that we were both very fond of. Profanatica is a band near and dear to my heart who is perhaps on average the best of the bands in this circle, but Demoncy has the strength of the legendary Joined in Darkness behind them, which I think is just flat out the best record that has ever been released in this little sub-style of extreme metal. It is, I'm at some point in the near future, I'll try to talk about it on an episode for patrons or something, but it is possibly the most evil thing that's ever been released. Joined in Darkness sounds like something beyond Satan. It sounds like something older and more terrible than time itself. It's just the coolest fucking thing ever.
That sounds pretty good.
It's really good, but it's also a record that's so singular that listening to any other Demoncy is kind of a tricky proposition. You just have to understand that that is a record that you can put out once in a lifetime, and, you know, fundamentally everything else has to be graded differently. The thing is, the rest of Demoncy's output is really, really good also, and Black Star Gnosis isn't different in that sense. For those who aren't familiar, Demoncy trades in a similar sort of music to Profanatica, Von, Black Funeral, all these stalwarts of early primitive U.S. Black Death. But the devil's in the details, pun not intended. And Demoncy...
Come on.
Okay, it was a little intended. Come on, I'm just being a cute guy. Demoncy has always been a little bit colder and more remote and a little bit more traditionally black metal than, say, Profanatica or a lot of the other bands that we would associate with this style. And I think that they are a pretty good way to maybe get a more traditional black metal listener into this substyle and appreciating some of the idiosyncrasies of it. But Black Metal Guy, I know that I've talked your ear off about Demoncy in the past, but have you ever listened to them?
I think I listened to some of maybe Enthroned is the Night or something, and thought it was cool. It did sound, so we've talked a lot about how this whole style, and you've emphasized this, how this whole style of US BM is really, in terms of the riffing and harmonic ideas and the attitude and the tone, much more rooted in death metal than the Scandinavian and other European black metal stuff, with the exception of maybe, Archgoat and Baharet, who have a lot to do with this American style. But the And we've referenced the J-Dog interview with Paul Ledney, where he talks about that specifically, that this is supposed to be death metal. And so I can hear, when I heard that earlier Demoncy stuff, it definitely, you could hear things that sounded like Scandinavian black metal riffs in it, in a way that you can't with Profanatica. It does seem like, the first record is called Within the Sylvan Realms of Frost, right? So maybe there's a bit more influence from that stuff in Demoncy. And there are some riffs on this one, too, that sound a little bit more traditionally black metal. It is definitely colder than Profanatica. I would say I find this one less engaging than the Profanatica record. Now, maybe that's because I have maybe a higher tolerance than some black metal people or like, not a higher tolerance. I actively like really chunky, heavy, brutal stuff. And it's on the more punkish side of death metal. So hearing that from the Profanatica made a lot of sense to me. This is very, very austere, and there's a coldness. The tone is much thicker than the cold tone you would get from Scandinavia, but it's very cold. It's very sort of slideshow of riffs writing. Is there a drummer, do you think, or is this drum machine?
This is a drum machine. Demoncy's lineup is odd. It's always Ixathra as like the main guy, but some records are solo and some are with a band, and he plays live with a band, but I believe this is a solo record.
Yeah, so I think this is I would say that, like, this isn't like converting me to a massive Demoncy fan. I think I would have had to be into them from when I was younger for that, you know what I mean? I think I'll have to hear Joined in Darkness. But it's cool, and there were parts of the record where I listened the first time and felt legitimately bored, but then when I went back and listened again, especially in my second sample, Cosmic Curse Expulsion, I was like, oh, okay, well, this has got to be the worst song on the record. And then I went back to it and it was like, maybe going to pull it for a critical sample or something, and it was like, hey, this is actually good. So there's a lot of there is, in these simple, highly chromatic buzzsawing power chord riffs, they can sound like other bands' kind of throwaway gestures, the kind of default riffing you get in war metal, but each one of these riffs is fully intended. It's a direct statement. It's been worked on and is interacting meaningfully with the riffs around it. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, I would say this is cool. I'm glad I heard it, and we should talk about it more.
Yeah, I definitely get what you mean in terms of this being less engaging than Crux Simplex by Profanatica. It just fundamentally is. Demoncy... Profanatica is, in a sense, very live music, and Demoncy is very dead music.
Yeah.
Demoncy sounds very deliberately flat and cold and mechanical in a way that Profanatica can sometimes, but Profanatica is more of like a sort of broken old piece of industrial machinery, and Demoncy is sort of clean and calculated and precise and written to a grid,
and it's in space.
Yeah, it's very much in space. Demoncy's always kind of been in space long before that was like an aesthetic idea of like newer black metal bands or something, but I have a feeling that Ixathra probably had some sort of communication with the dude from Lustmord or something like that, especially given his penchant for dark ambient stuff. But what might seem like sort of old hat now, this association between sort of like dark Gnostic mysticism and Satanism and weird outer space and subterranean stuff, Demoncy were really sort of one of the first bands to put all that stuff together. Sorry,
that makes sense. No, I was just that makes sense, and that would have like really influenced, say, bands like Inquisition, for whom that is now central to the lyrics.
Oh yeah, definitely. And we also have to remember that one of the things that makes Demoncy so distinct in that regard is that Ixithra is like really a true believer. This guy is a very dedicated occultist who has been doing Demoncy for about 30 years now. This guy's really all in on it. And I think that one of the things that appeals to me so much about Demoncy is that even in these riffs, which can be sort of arbitrary and gestural, there's a weight of force and belief, and just the knowledge that these things are so deliberately composed, even in their reductive, stripped-down simplicity, gives them a sort of outsized power. Mm-hmm. There's most Demoncy is oriented around very simple trem riffing, but a lot of it related to those dark Dorian ideas that you'll hear in that you'll hear in Profanautica or later bands like Prosanctus and Fairy and Paimon Gate, but with very strange note placement, strange elongated rhythmic phrases for individual notes, and a strange warping around the root note that'll occur. Joined in Darkness, in particular, was dotted with very simple but very off-putting time signature play that it's the sort of thing that you would accidentally arrive on as sort of an amateur guitarist, but here they were being pursued very deliberately. The overall effect of this record, in particular, is something very deliberately stripped down and almost rebooting of the band, in a sense, to arrive back at the band's earliest ideas of these sort of monotonous tremolo riff and drum machine compositions that start in a sort of arbitrary location, end in an arbitrary location, and present themselves as fragments of this sort of like limitless continuum of darkness, which I think is really cool.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, it goes with the space thing. I think that Ixithra would probably say that all of these songs are like, you're just getting a look at something that stretches infinitely, before and after. The infinite riff idea we talk about, but driven toward nefarious purposes. So with that in mind, let's listen to just the first full black metal song on the record, Ipsissimus of Shadows. Most of the tracks on this record are pretty short, just around 3 minutes long, and they're pretty simple, just 3 or 4 riff compositions, so let's just listen to the whole thing and see what happens. So that is pretty characteristic of what this whole album sounds like. I mean, that's a song that is oriented around really just 3 riffs, and the first couple are just very straightforward little Profanatica style numbers, but it's really all about that 3rd riff that dominates the middle toward the end of the track. This elongated, sort of darkly neoclassical Dorian figure with an A-B variation, and the B variation is just based off of a slight weird elongation of one of the notes in the concluding phrase. But there's a tremendous amount of impact in how it swings into the 1 of the next repetition as a result of it. It's kind of a left field comparison, but I don't think it really is. So we talk about Profanatica, we talk about all the associated acts around that, we talk about Black Funeral, but something that I compare Demoncy to a lot actually is Mortician in the way that the music is executed. You know, oriented around the drum machine as an organizing principle, almost arbitrarily selected intervals on guitar. And we also have to keep in mind that Mortician was, in some sense, like, connected with a lot of these bands, because John McEntee from Incantation was briefly in Mortician as they started. Paul Ledney knew the guys from Mortician, and as we've talked about on the show, Mortician has something to do with early primitive grindcore and Celtic Frost, which a lot of the guys in, Profanatica and Demoncy were also drawing off of. So there's a whole pool of bands here who are playing around with similar ideas in these sort of like dark, occult, extremely raw styles of death and black and grindcore. And it's just something that I've been perpetually charmed by. So listening to Demoncy now, listening to him execute music in this manner, in some sense feels extremely current, especially with the revitalization of scrappy, blocky, one-man black metal projects that sort of went by the wayside for a good chunk of the 2010s. But it's also just a return back to how this was executed in the early 90s. And I think that unstuck from time quality is something that really appeals to me. There's something timeless about this style of extreme metal, and I think that's why it sticks with me so much to this day.
Would you say that stylistically it's doing the same thing as he's doing with the riffs, right? The riffs are supposed to be, right, or the song as a whole, right, is a brief sort of snapshot or cross-section of an infinite process, a thing that existed before and after the song will keep existing. And do you think like there's a similar thing where the style as a whole is supposed to be this kind of frozen cross-section of eternity?
I don't know if it's deliberate.
Not deliberate, maybe. No, yeah, not supposed to. But does that make sense to you? Like, they've achieved the same thing on a stylistic level. It has that kind of disciplined stasis about it.
I think so, because I think that Profanatica songs and Mortician songs and Von songs all operate under the same principles. A very restricted palette. All the music kind of sounds a deliberate, rigorous homogeneity. And in the same sense, it's almost the same principle that Ildjarn works under, or early Burzum works under. These are guiding principles of early extreme metal that never go out of fashion, I think, if you're into this music enough.
Yeah, and I think in the 90s, this would have been understood as having a lot to do with something like Burzum or Ildjarn, or even, despite the different social milieus, like the first 2 Darkthrone records, for sure. Or Transylvanian Hunger in terms of how rigid and sort of looping it is. I'm looking at his first record, and he's got tracks like The Final Battle for Our Once Glorious Midgard, So it's not as he doesn't have the sort of he doesn't have the chip on his shoulder about Norwegian stuff that Ledney does.
No, I think Demoncy and Black Funeral were the most amenable to European styles of that scene.
And I think a lot of fans would have heard the obvious similarities, right? In terms of the, we often now associate Burzum with where Burzum was going, which is basically Bellis, as Varg has made clear. And so with stuff on, the more lush stuff on Philosophem, or the most pagan-sounding stuff on the early records. But there's just a lot of, like, sawing, dissonant, frantically repeating riffs, even on Fis Licitaros. It doesn't really directly sound like Hellhammer, but it's you can hear the connection. I have something pedantic to say, which is that the riff you're talking about as Dorian, I think it's not, or at least it's not what I meant by that term. And so here there's a second correction. I also have to make a correction of myself. Did you ever see that guy who commented on our Argoslent review? And he said, Argoslent does not use Dorian so much as Aeolian mode.
Oh, okay.
And I looked it up, and I was like, God damn it. I've been confidently calling it the wrong fucking mode the entire time. So every time we've talked about... What?
Yeah, isn't Aeolian just like one or two notes off of Dorian, if I recall correctly?
Aren't they all one or two notes off from each other?
I feel like I remember those two being pretty... I mean, I assume this guy's correct. But yeah.
No. What you're not wrong, dude. What it is apparently it was associated at one point in history. It was called the Hypo-Dorian mode for below Dorian, because it's supposed to be a... it's somehow harmonically closely related to the Dorian.
Okay. Man, I'm going to have to learn like actual music theory instead of faking my way through it.
It's the one. Basically, it's the one because it's the Aeolian or the natural minor. It ends on two whole steps, so it's got that epic space from the minor 6 to from the flat 6 to the 7, and then from the flat 7 to the root. Right.
Okay.
So you can go like, which is all we ever like to do in this music.
So all that sort of exaggeratedly dark Dorian stuff is probably Aeolian?
Yeah, that's what I think most of the time when we say Dorian, we actually mean Aeolian or Hypo-Dorian. Okay. And possibly I was confused by Plato calling the Dorian the most noble of the modes, and it seems obvious, or something like that, right? And it seems obvious that that's what the Hypo-Dorian is in metal. So, but who knows? These terms have changed a lot historically, so maybe he meant the Hypo-Dorian. I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway, but point being, that thing in the middle seems to be more like weird, eerie Eastern scale.
Yeah, Demoncy will play around with some sort of like dark Phrygian stuff, sort of like Paimon Gate does.
Yeah.
He's always kind of like, the thing is like the Demoncy riffs tend to be so simple. It's almost like it's difficult to almost apply specific modes to them, and they just sort of float in and out of each other.
Maybe Eastern isn't even right. I think it's just more traditionally in that kind of like, the evil minor scales with a lot of chromatics thrown in that we typically use in black metal and in early black metal.
Very
metal, right?
Very silent horror film soundtrack stuff.
Yeah. So it's got that kind of highly dissonant minor vibe in it. I think the one my second sample, Cosmic Curse Expulsion, has a Snake Charmer riff on it. But the or maybe actually the first one. But anyway, on that note,
curses.
yeah. Should we move to the next samples?
Sure.
Yeah. But yeah, that riff is awesome, and I heard the same thing you did. That the way the second repetition, he holds the note at the beginning of the turnaround. The first repetition he delivers the turnaround very straight, very like on beat, and then the second one he holds the first note of the turnaround so it syncopates and draws out. And I like what you said. It really whips into the beginning of the riff again. It has that. Yeah. Very cool riff. Cosmic Curse Invocation. Yes, I have sampled both the Cosmic Curse tracks. This track has 4 riffs in it.
Getting ambitious.
Yeah. And there are a couple things I want to point out about the structure. The structures are so simple that I felt like, okay, I have to think about them, right? And this is one that'll make you think, because see if you can tell where the second riff starts. Okay, so that last riff that comes in, do 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 do, right? That feel has more of that epic Aeolian feel we were talking about, and that you also hear in early Profanatica stuff, or on the last Profanatica record. Right? Yeah, that feels. But then a lot of that riffing is much more dissonant, much more narrow interval. The thing that's interesting is that riff 1 and riff 2 are almost exactly the same. The riff 1 is like, or they're not, but it really sounds the same because they have similar gestures in them. The first one is like da 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 da. Basically there's like minute differences in like the first one does a half step up and then a chromatic slide down and then a half step up and then a chromatic slide down and keeps going. And then riff 2 goes like, drops da 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 da.
Yeah, they're just like primitive like death grind riffs basically.
Yeah, and they both have the same kind of da 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 chromatic drop in them, and so you hear them as the same riff basically, but the second one is like has twice as much detail in it, and it turns around with the da da da. It has this higher turnaround, and there's kind of a weird hypnotic thing where the riff resets and you don't even notice it basically. You feel like you've been listening to the same thing the whole time.
Well, there's this specific technique that is sort of unique to Ixithra and the way that he'll write certain riffs, where he'll have a root note where you know how most most like simple metal riffs are designed to create a gesture that naturally flows back into the root note for like a really explosive like hit on the one of the next repetition. Ixithra will write riffs where he gets back to the root note prematurely, and he'll just sort of double it up so you never get that immediate impact into it, and you think that you're like hearing a weird time signature or something at first, but you know, it'll be like on the frets, it'll be like 1 3 0 1 1 3 0 1. So he'll hit the root note on the 4, which sort of dislocates everything in a weird way. So I think that's some of what you're hearing here.
Oh, yeah. That's something I wanted to get. That's a very good way of putting it. So Ixithra, like Ledney, he does the thing. You pointed this out in Ledney, right? Ledney will do his chugs not at the beginning of the riff, or he won't drop to his. Ledney doesn't necessarily chug on the root tone. The chug isn't necessarily the root, and he throws the chug in the middle of the riff, right? So you might get like right, and not in sort of predictable ways that a thrash riff might drop to the root. This has that same kind of. Ixithra uses a similar technique where you're not immediately moving to the root, or you're not moving to the root in predictable ways, but it, instead of Profanatica, like, defers it in a way that's really heavy, but Demoncy obscures it.
Yeah.
Like, there's, the root is this, that's what I was trying to get at when I was listening to those two riffs. I couldn't even tell you what the fucking root was in those. In those two kind of cryptic, almost identical riffs. They both kind of hide what the root is. And then there's a third riff that just sort of does a thrashy key change up a fifth, stops, restarts, does the first two riffs, and then finally we get to the da 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 da, that sort of epic Aeolian riff, and it's only there that you really hear a center to the tonality, right? That there's an identifiable root. And I'm not even sure it was the root tone in the preceding riffs. I think maybe he actually raises the root one or two steps.
Yeah, the root note tends to, it gets sort of smeared across the riffs in a lot of Demoncy stuff. It's not, a lot of metal riffs are oriented around using the root note as a sort of anchor point or a foundation that the rest of the riff builds off of. But Demoncy doesn't really treat the root note with that much significance. It's a much more horizontal way of developing riffs that makes it, like, while it sounds at first blush so similar to other bands in the style, it actually ends up being, like, really weird. You know, like, almost this, it's got, I mean, we've gone to this well before, but it's almost got this, like, serialist quality to it. You know, the deprioritization of, like, the natural heavy tones. So everything ends up being a little grayer and messier and weirder when Demoncy does it, even for, like, kind of stock gestures.
Yeah, it's like serialism, but good.
That's like when we talk about war metal, it's like war metal but with riffs. Oh, those are just the war metal bands you like. Yeah, serialism but good. It's just when we like it. Okay, so another one. Probably my favorite track on the album, Performing the Ceremonies of Tragedy. This one is basically just a death metal song, and Demoncy is awesome when they're fast, but they're at their best when they're very slow. Big chunks of Joined in Darkness are like borderline Funeral Doom tempo, and I think that Ixithra has a special ear for those kinds of tempos. So let's listen to what happens when Demoncy basically just starts a song with a section from Autopsy. So it's been a long time since I've listened, but I think that opening riff might be directly referential to Autopsy, but like really early Autopsy, like something off Severed Survival or Retribution for the Dead. I think it might be In the Grip of Winter, but I'm not sure. This is something that Demoncy's traded in for a long time, these sort of doom death passages that still have that specific, like, Americanized, darkly bluesy quality with those little descending dyad figures. You know, that da-da-da-da thing. That's something that you would hear dotted across slower songs on Joined in Darkness, and it has never really gone away. And that's something that I really appreciate. I mean, if you think, looking back into the history of this music, it kind of makes sense that early death metal bands that would start flirting with sort of black metal ideas would also gravitate to sort of the creepiest parts of early doom death. And I think that that's a relationship that's kind of forgotten in black metal nowadays. The doom death that you will hear associated with black metal is going to tend more toward the Peaceville side in a lot of cases. But I think that Ixithra makes a really good argument for how maybe it would be cool if that was a continuing part of the legacy today.
Yeah, and really, I mean, the Peaceville thing isn't something a lot of people mention. I feel like that's mostly us connecting that to early black metal. So that's not well known, and the Autopsy, the connection to stuff like the dirtier death doom, like Autopsy or Asphyx, I suppose, is mentioned even less, but that's got to be... It makes sense, right? Because Autopsy is kind of... I mean, all those bands were really into those sort of Celtic Frost, Repulsion, Master, Deathstrike, Slaughter type music that bands like Darkthrone reference as really important, and that I think a lot of the early black metal bands could sort of take for granted as influences.
Well, yeah, and it's all part of sort of a greater legacy of like forgotten, like occult death metal.
Yeah.
And you can still hear that in the sort of currently active band. I was going to say newer bands, but I guess Coffins isn't a new band at this point. I guess Coffins is borderline a classic band at this point.
That really dates us.
Well, yeah. I mean, the first Coffins record is like 99, 2000, something like that. Shit. Yeah. But that's a good example of a band that is like basically just a Celtic Frost and Hellhammer worship band, but it's kind of a doom death band. But Coffins also kind of like feels like a black metal band a lot of the time too,
because it's so retarded. I know what you mean, because it's very sort of obscure and minimalist, and that's that whole sort of confusion that Ledney brings up in that interview, that sort of confusion about what the place of punk is in these various offshoots of death metal, right? Because you can hear Coffins as being punky in a death metal crusty way, but also punky in the way that black metal is.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me. What was I gonna say? Oh, remember that band I liked this record more than you did, but you remember that Azath album?
Yeah.
It was kind of like it felt kind of war metal to me, but was very death metal in the overall delivery, more than black metal. Just like sort of austere, dry, blasting death metal that was very fast. And you were like, okay, this is all right, but really it just sounds like Autopsy. And so that makes sense, because the Azath record sort of felt like a black metal album, and I could hear Autopsy then doing that too.
Yeah, you would probably dig a lot of early Autopsy. I think that's something you might actually enjoy a lot.
That's something I need to go back to, yeah. Well, so, speaking of other things that I dig, also those riffs were awesome in Performing Ceremonies of Tragedy, especially I really liked the last one. I was going to say one thing, it might be that, like, I think the best Demoncy riffs are written at a slow tempo, whether or not there's blasting. There are the sort of things like the last riff in your sample, or the last riff in my last sample, that might unfold over a wall of blasts at a high tempo, or maybe like double bass. They're usually written very deliberately at a slower pace, which gives him more room to breathe and unfurl these long melodies. Whereas the faster, often the blasting that has more convulsive riffing is maybe less interesting. So it makes sense that like he naturally moves at lower tempos, ergo the doom riffs you find the most engaging. The ones where he just fully commits to those low tempos you find more engaging.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to the second Cosmic Curse. We had Cosmic Curse Invocation. Now, you don't want the Cosmic Curse to hang around for too long, so it's time for Cosmic Curse Expulsion.
Yeah, get it out of there. That is a weird thing that happens on that last riff.
Oh, that one's awesome.
I can't even tell if it's a second guitar line or if it's just the bass dropping down to a really weird lower note there, creating this very strange dissonant harmony or something, but something very stomach churning happens when they come back to it. He's sustaining it's somehow, I think it's a third riff, but it's somehow related. It's very closely related to the first riff, right? And the first riff. When I first heard that, I was just like, that's a Nya and a Boo Boo riff, right? Well, the first two are phrases that have been taken from the first song and been readjusted. The first Cosmic Curse, yeah. Like that second one with the really Phrygian flair, that that one's like a rearrangement of one of the priority riffs in Invocation.
Interesting. All right, I did not catch that, but the second one sounds really Eastern. That's the most sort of curvy sword riff on this one, but the first one. I initially did not like it because it just sounded like one of those kind of boring sliding around the root note riffs. But it's got that really heavy drop to the root at the end. Is that technique of a sort of obscured or deferred relationship to the root, and that's pretty heavy. It's pretty gut busting. And then when it comes back to it sort of on that third riff. It's like he strips away most of the detail and he's holding notes way longer than you expect. He's also like feathering or doing something to the notes because they're single string, but he's doing something to make them ring more. Maybe he's letting the strings harmonize more. He's like holding one as he plays the other a little bit more than you would. There's
something very strange going on.
And we are back from discussing the many virtues of Impaled Nazarene to review something else brash and grindy and in your face and defiantly northern. This is The Scythe is Remorseless by Yersin, out now on Trepanation Recordings. That's Yersin, as in Yersinia Pestis, the Black Death. So, we've reviewed this band before. This record is officially coming out in early 2024, which makes it, over 3 years since the last one. This was a very early Terminus review, right around this time of year in 2020. And the last one was called Guilt. And Yersin are interesting because they are coming out of the hardcore scene, but engaging with a lot of black and death metal aesthetics. Now, that in itself is hardly remarkable, right? And if anything, it's usually a warning sign that what you're going to be getting is a kind of marketing gimmick or an attempt to glean some secondhand edge, right, from the extreme metal scene. But the what's interesting about Yersin is that there's a more substantial influence there, both in terms of the musical techniques and the spirit of the music. So this is, yes, another band from the hardcore scene that uses warhead art, but the warhead art is actually pretty cool on this one, and I think the music does a good job of earning it. It is... this band sort of seems to position themselves as a crust band in some ways, and we've talked about how that term doesn't really mean anything anymore. This doesn't really sound like crust, although you could say maybe it is a modern high-tech analog of the 80s stenchcore, because it does have very heavy chugging mid-tempo parts, and it does have a kind of grim medievalism to it, but the similarity stops there. It's kind of a throw everything at the kitchen sink amalgamation of, I think, especially modern beatdown, the most beefy sort of Wolf Brigade tragedy kind of most beefy martyrdom, most beefy crust, arena crust we call it, which was really like crust core, I digress, and grind of some kind. But all of it is colored by authentic black metal influence, which I think is mostly coming in through their guitarist, Rob. And it's and the feeling we got on the best tracks on Guilt, there was a kind of manic grinding energy and a very heavy tone that you could really only get in this kind of music, but it felt sort of mountainous and bleak in a way that reminded me a lot of Immortal, especially Sons of Northern Darkness. But it didn't really sound like Immortal because of all the hardcore in it. And so there was this cool potential band that was in that record that was there alongside tracks that were just much more straight up sort of beat down songs, things that just kind of sounded like knocked loose in a way that was really at odds with the more metallic tracks. But at its best, Yersin sort of pointed towards this translation of mountainous Norwegian black metal to desolate Yorkshire cliffs and moors. And I think this record is I don't know if it's all the way there yet. We'll talk about that, but this is a big step in that direction. The metal has been much more blended with the hardcore elements, and there's more of a continued atmosphere throughout the record. The last one had some kind of the song title, the kind of jokey throwaway song titles you would get in grind or screamo bands sometimes. There is, unfortunately, one of them here, the death metal guy. You want to point it out?
Lust for Crust is pretty unforgivable.
Yeah. That's one for the scene. It is the riffs are really good, so it's unfortunate that it has the kind of like throwaway crowd pleaser lyrics. However, the rest of the record has a much more serious bent to it, and that's reflected in the music as well. So I really enjoyed this. It's got the kind of really satisfying tone that is fun about those modern crust records or beatdown stuff, while also having enough texture and dynamism in the guitar work for me to find engaging. But there's definitely still some things they could work out. Death Metal Guy, what did you think of it?
So I think this one, like you said, is a lot more put together than Guilt. Guilt definitely sounded like a band that was still trying to find its footing in terms of sound. Now, this one sounds a lot more established, and Yersin as a band has a much more distinct identity. It's still not something that I'm super into, but I'm willing to cede that as just sort of a personal taste thing. These guys are after things that I'm not particularly interested in, but that's not an issue with them. That's just a personal matter. What I think Yersin is really after, the dominant influence on this one sounds like Nails to me. If anyone remembers Nails, the biggest band in the world for like 6 months.
That's true.
But I actually A/B tested it. I went back and listened to a little bit of You Will Never Be One of Us today. Mm-hmm. And Nails, unsurprisingly, is also a band that I'm not really fond of. But they had their place in the sun for a while, and it is kind of interesting that even after their sort of wild success, there weren't many bands that followed in those footsteps trying to pick up and carry forth that sort of grinding HM2 hardcore with a sort of anthemic quality to it that they stake their claim on. And that seems to be what Yersin is after, augmented by more substantial death and black metal influences. I think there's some interesting things about this record. I think that these guys are pretty good at picking out the details of sort of the predecessor styles that a lot of people would ignore. Old school Swedeath is a pretty big feature of this record, but the way that it's executed isn't with the parts or the kinds of riffs you would most immediately associate with that style. Yeah, it's definitely sort of the weirdest, most hardcore parts of Grave, or some of the stuff that Dismember or Entombed were doing after their initial biggest records, more of their mid to late 90s stuff. Especially Entombed getting to their more death and roll territory, I think is a substantial influence here. And I think that's pretty cool, because that's just not a sound that you hear basically at all anymore. Those mid-era Entombed records are surprisingly good, and a lot of people I've noticed, even people in our Discord who are really deep into it, actually have a lot of positive things to say about those records, and so do I. So overall, while it's not for me, I think these guys are executing what they're going for very well, and there's some aspects to this music that elevate it beyond its initial conceit, and it's probably worth checking out for people that are a little bit more interested in this modern sort of crust or crust adjacent style than I happen to be.
So what you said about Swedish death being implemented in an unusual way, I think that's something I was going to say too, but from a different angle. The other thing I hear is a lot of the more melodic parts of Dismember. Or really just a lot of Slaughter of the Soul, but it doesn't sound like Slaughter of the Soul worship metalcore at all. I think it has to do, it's what you said. This is what you said about Nails and about this record is perceptive, right? It's blasting HM2 hardcore. Most of the HM2 hardcore kind of lumbers along or moves at deliberately down tempo. This has a lot of blasts that are slowed to be heavy, very fast D beats, and then sort of doomy slow parts. But none of it rhythmically moves in the way we're used to, either from melodeath metalcore or from like heavy HM2 hardcore. So it's got this, it's bringing all those Swedish death metal influences to a completely different format that, yeah, maybe has more in some ways more to do with like Nihilist or Grave, which really do sound kind of grindy. And also linking them up more with black metal. Like a lot of the really epic riffs on this record sound like Immortal, but they also kind of sound like At the Gates.
Yeah, and it's interesting, especially in the distance that we've grown away from some of those pivotal records. I was actually, I think I was listening to Slaughter of the Soul the other day, just because it had been a lot of years since I'd last heard it. And we've talked about how that's actually a cool record, which it is. I mean, we've come far, when we were coming up, it was so decried, by people as, being the source of American melodeath metalcore that got so popular in the 2000s. And it is, but Slaughter of the Soul is actually a far more challenging and complex record than you would think, given its influence on much simpler, more straightforward bands. I think that it's just been, it's been so many years since most of us have heard it. We think of it as many more steps away from original At the Gates than it actually is. Is it more accessible than, Terminal Spirit Disease? Yeah, of course. But it's not fucking Kill Switch Engage. It's not Black Dahlia Murder.
The beat on the title track, almost nobody has ever imitated. They're doing a 6/8 beat, but they do it with the regularity of a thrash beat. Rather than like the standard 6/8 gallop thing. That's really unique. I mean, there's just people take for granted the quality of the riffing, right? The ornate neoclassical riffing. If you want to get a different take on that record, people should listen to tracks like Cold, which, and you can hear there, this is like the same kind of shit Dawn was doing. It's just in a much more punchy, hardcore influenced format.
Yeah.
It's a cool record. And so
At the Gates' great crime was getting adequate production, basically.
Right. And so Yersin has some of that, reminding us that At the Gates was actually really cool and and very closely related to a lot of things that are cool about black metal. So without further ado, we're talking epic riffs. Let's go for the first track, Triumphant. And here you can hear that mountainous atmosphere. Think of the things that they're doing that create a sense of huge vertical spaces. don't know. That part gives me chills, man. I love the sort of the brute grunting of "it feels like the sky is falling in." Just simple, direct lyric over just the massive doom riff with the keys flying away in the background. I love that.
I will say it's substantially more melodically interesting listening on headphones now. I had just listened to this on speakers prior. And I think that this is one of the problems of like HM2 guitar tones for me, which is that if you're not listening on relatively high-end equipment, you lose so much tone color from that HM2 tone just because it's so oversaturated. So, like, most of the D-beat riffs on this record, if you're just listening on relatively low quality speakers, just sort of blur together.
Oh, they're just gonna sound like Jogo Jogo Jogo.
Yeah, because a lot of what he's doing, now that I can hear it a little bit better, so he's using like black metal chord phrasing, like Shoutrog type dyadic chord phrasing, and that's where the melody's coming from. That gets lost on like car speakers. With HM2 tones. That's why I'm not an HM2 hater, but I am critical of the common HM2 narrative, let's say. Just because it's like, yeah, it can create a really cool tone, but at the possible cost of a ton of tone color, depending on how you're listening to it and how the EQing is. So maybe that's just something to keep in mind for people, is like, maybe try this out on the best stuff that you have available rather than your default.
Well, that's interesting, because usually I'm the guy who listened on speakers and you're the guy who listened on more high-end headphones. And this time I've only listened to this record on headphones, and I've just been like, damn, this sounds great. Because you can hear all those layers, you know, you can hear, I mean, I think the key thing is that, but yeah, I hear what you mean as a thing for the band to consider, right? How are you producing this? I think if it can, you know, if you can't hear it on laptop speakers, that's one thing. But like if you lose the tone on car speakers, which are usually pretty or large scale, were you listening in your living room or like in a car?
I was listening to it in my car and just sort of like computer speakers.
Okay, yeah, computer speakers aren't maybe going to do it, but like you should be able to pick up the details on a car speaker, right? Because those are like big, those are usually pretty high quality.
Yeah, but the problem, they tend to sort of like boost bass by default because they have dedicated subs, so you can get some issues there. But this is pure autism shit. Right.
Well, the bass is already pretty boosted on this, so cool things that happen there, right? You get the so over the D beat, you could hear the textured black metal chord. As you said, it sounds really Finnish. The only thing in Crust that really sounds like that is Martyr Dod's more recent stuff. There's also a band called Facade from the US, FASAD, who do that pretty well, but in a more screamo way. But you get that thick, heavy power chord tone, but with all the embellishment of the sliding harmonics from black metal. And a thing that Yersin did before that I like a lot, which is these staggered blasts with slashing chords across them. Sounds really cool. And then there's a neat misdirection. They play that dum dum da da dum da dum 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 da da dum. That sort of doomy slow riff, they play it, but it transitions into a beatdown riff that's rhythmically and melodically very different. But the melodic sort of momentum from that phrase gets transferred to the keyboards, and the keys just go crazy. They're using this very sophisticated modern patch that sort of sounds like keys and then sort of morphs into a strange choir or something, but it's this sort of this wandering Aeolian melody that is completely detached from what the guitars are doing, and it reminds me a lot of those flyaway riffs that you brought my attention to in Following the Voice of Blood. and things like that. It has a really sort of deranged Polish black metal vibe. I know, I know this. I know Rob listens to, enjoys the Temple of Full Moon stuff, and it also reminds me of like the most nuts BBH stuff, like Rundagore or something.
Yeah.
So it's wild hearing something like that in a. It's wild hearing something like that over a beatdown. And
well, that's
I
just,
mean,
that's just designed for you.
I was gonna say that fulfills a certain fantasy I didn't know I had, but that very much designed for me. The beatdown itself is really well written too, in that it kind of he's piles on extra notes in places you wouldn't expect to make it much heavier. And then, it just rolls out into... And then the doom riff comes back. By doom, I really just mean slow riff. It's just a slow black metal riff. It really it's like... It's a Mountains of Might or, like, Blashirk Mighty Ravendark riff. And that comes back. And then they turn that, too, into a beat down. Dung, 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 with the grunts over it. So, super, super cool to me. And in that big slow riff, you can hear another secret ingredient of the guitar style here, which is inverted power chords in the way that Immortal uses them. So remember when we reviewed Sons of Northern Darkness and they do like, ugh, we're the tyrants.
Yeah.
Right? They're just sick ringing inverted power chords. Rob does a lot of really cool stuff here with the sort of the noise surrounding the note in the guitar playing.
Yeah, I feel you. All right, let me get to one. Let me get to the title track. This is when I heard this one, I was really intrigued because, like I said up front, this is reminding me of parts of 90s Swedeth that are completely forgotten. There was a big propensity, especially after the first couple records by all of the seminal Swedish death metal bands, to move in a direction that was, if not imitating, at least informed by the proliferation of groove metal stuff over in the US. But it's articulated in a very different way. So let's listen to the Scythe is Remorseless and pay attention to the main sort of chuggy verse riff here. And you can definitely imagine how this is, like, grave responding to the existence of Machine Head back in the mid-90s.
Go!
So do you see what I mean by that main riff? That da 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 dun 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 dun.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a kind of riff that's like actually very typical for like mid to late 90s sweet death, but it's totally forgotten now because it's like not a cool kind of riff anymore. But you can see the relationship there where it's like the Stockholm death metal bands who were we all know about the sort of like momentary death of death metal in the late 90s into the early 2000s, sort of coming back to life as we started to get into metal in the mid 2000s. But a lot of the European death metal bands really kept going and managed to survive that transitional period a little bit better than a lot of the American bands did. So here you can hear the sort of principle of a band like Entombed or Grave hearing what Sepultura started to turn into, in like Chaos AD and later, and adapt to those changing circumstances. Like still trying to stay solidly within the style that they play, but adapting to changing market conditions. So it's interesting to hear Yersin drawing off those kinds of riffs. Now, it's entirely possible that those kinds of chuggy riffs exist in places in hardcore that I'm just not that familiar with. But this strikes me as more directly referential to just sort of a forgotten period of extreme metal.
I think that period has been rehabilitated in modern beatdown, specifically. So it's a case of interest in a section of, because everyone's like, oh no, we like these like ignorant groove riffs. Sepultura has been rehabilitated. The later Sepultura, right, is important for all this modern beatdown. And I'm sure people will just bite the bullet on Machine Head at this point. Well,
I don't know if I could go that far, Black, but we gotta have limits.
I'm not going there. But I'm not wearing like $50 sweatpants.
Well, that does make sense though, because that riff is positioned against a sort of like down tempo interpretation of the same riff. I don't know if you know this. Is this an 8-string guitar that Rob is playing?
I have no idea.
Because it sounds either he's playing on an 8-string or something odd is happening between the bass and the guitar in some of those sections, because it really sounds like he's either dropping down to an F sharp there on an 8-string, or maybe he's got like an octave pedal or something that he's hitting to drop down.
I would believe it's an 8-string.
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to tell through the HM2, but if it is an 8-string, that's interesting because it means that he's not orienting these riffs around the lowest string. He's just using it as a place to dive down for access while primarily playing it as a 7-string guitar, which I think is a really useful technique. I played 8-string for a few years. I'd like to get back into it, and as more and more people get into those sort of exaggerated extended ranges with 8-strings, I think more people are starting to realize that the best way to use those instruments is not to be riding on the low F sharp the whole time, but to use it as a further range that they can dip into periodically in moments of drama, rather than using it as like a primary riffing space, because it just, you run out of frequency range to really make articulate stuff happen.
Interesting. Yeah, it's basically then like you're playing the same guitar, but it starts way lower, right? It's it's like you're playing a 6-string, it just starts on 8.
Well, yeah, you have the option to go lower when a riff calls for it, rather than, because so much when you're playing 6-string metal guitar, so much of your riffing, especially in something like death metal, is going to function off of that lowest root note that you have available, and you kind of can't do that beyond a 7-string, because once you start getting, standard tuning for an 8-string is an F sharp, which is going to put you really near, or basically at the top end of standard tuning bass frequency. You run out of territory, and it becomes very difficult to make tones that low make melodic sense unless you're doing a ton of production work. So using it as more of like an accent, I think, is probably the way to go for most musicians.
Word. Well, now that we've had some focus on the more metallic aspects of the record, here's one that is basically you could call it a D beatdown. But there's cool stuff happening that retains continuity with the more metallic tracks, so that it's not just out of place. And this one starts with a pretty cool wind-up section. We're going to start the sample just towards the end of that, so you get a bit of it. This is Red Mist. So the verse riff to this is just a really solid driving D-beat passage where they sort of take advantage of these are all really good musicians. I think like every player, it's a three-piece, every player is quite good. And they take advantage of that to sort of there's maybe a little more shape to the riffing than you would often get with a D-beat riff at that tempo. It has more of a like elaborate Swedish death metal shape, but it's a cool D beat, and you also have the contrast between the slashed chords, which aren't being sustained as much, and the driving drums. But so it sort of seems like it's anchored around that, but really the focus is everything else, especially that wind up riff at the beginning. Now that I'm listening again, it seems even more central. I was saying to you just as we started the sample, like that really just is like a Sepultura riff, right? Down, 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 down. It's equally something kind of like, Immure or something like Solar Flare Homicide.
Yeah, or Knocked Loose. I'm thinking that a lot of the big advancements in sort of modern digital hardcore, internet era hardcore, have to do with sort of slowed down interpretations of old thrash ideas, sort of the Slayer shirt, camo cargo shorts, metalcore coming back from the dead in a weird form.
Yeah, just with like way more interesting sort of digital textures. So yeah, you get, but it sort of lights into this really cool breakdown. And the thing that ties the breakdown to black metal basically is that Rob is dressing it up with these cascading arpeggio licks, right? And also with pick slides. Every time like the pick slide comes in, it just sounds like crowd killing, I gotta say. The pick slides are brutal. I mean, is this, as you say, this just is right up my alley in certain ways. Like, okay, big chuggy guitar that is filled with those kinds of like sort of simple musician-y embellishments I like, right? Like the pick slide is central to the riff. And what happens as the breakdown goes on, it loses the embellishments and sort of decays into the dow da dow da dow da dow thing. So you kind of, the lyric is right, it's the red mist is taking over. You kind of hear it as the song goes on. Sort of loses definition. But yeah, and, you know, lyrically, the red mist trope goes all the way from, you know, the berserkers of old Norse Yorkshire to the modern North FC. So you can hear a continuity there. Also, lyrically, it seems to be about smashing a pita, which in the UK is a pretty bold statement.
This is a little one Gash, and you're listening to Terminus.
And we are back from discussing the prospects of Elcrost, a related project, to bring you Blood Serpent, Bestial Extermination, out now on House of Ygra. So, this is a project of one half of Elcrost, by the name of Nadgor, and his bandmate Frostbite, who is an ex-member of Leucotomy, who we haven't covered on the show, but whose record, another Vietnamese band, whose record came out, I think, this year on House of Ygra. So this is the circle of bands that revolves around the gothic Black Death band Elcrost. But this is a very different flavor. It's billed as war metal inspired by Profane Order, Angel Corpse, Blasphemy, and Black Witchery. That only somewhat gives you an idea of what this sounds like. It's interesting to me to hear someone name check Angel Corpse, because that's a band that was sort of on the tip of everyone's tongues like 10 years ago or longer. They were seen as very one of the more, they were still more, they were more active. I don't think Angel Corpse has broken up, have they? Let's see. No, they have officially split.
Yeah, well, now there's Perdition Temple with Gene, which is sort of a spiritual successor.
So, right, so Order from Chaos splits off into Ares Kingdom, who pursue a more mid-tempo, resolute kind of black thrashing war metal, and Angel Corpse, who pursue a more morbid angel-influenced, angular, and frenzied variant of thrashing war metal. So this is influenced by Angel Corpse, but it doesn't have the same sort of dry cutting tone you get from Morbid Angel. It doesn't have the rasps, and it doesn't have, although it's very thrashy, it doesn't have the kind of it's not like the default riff is a pedal point thrash riff. And when you hear a thrash riff here, it's played much more in the satanic speed metal tradition where it's not palm muted. Tonally, it's also different because it's more in the native register of death metal in that it's focused more on the low end, and it has growls for the most part. And yet, there's stuff in here from Scandinavian black metal. For instance, the guitar tone, though low, is very fuzzy. And it sort of cuts across the bass, which is more audible here. Mm-hmm. And it is highly melodic, which, when we say it, basically means consonant. This does not have the chromatic dissonance of Blasphemy or Angel Corpse or any of these bands. However, it does have, you can hear the influence of the more sort of pure, sort of chaotic war metal stuff here in an interesting way. I would say I would class this less in the bestial war metal and more in the epic war metal thing, which is my new name for what we were calling arrogant thrash. But it doesn't really sound like it's influenced by any of our major touchstones for that, except maybe Angel Corpse. And the other interesting thing, which we can get into, is that if I had to name the dominant single guitar influence on this record, it would be Mayhem. There is just amazing Euronymous-influenced guitar work all over this, and it colors this. Nodgor just has a similar ear for harmony and melody, and there's even things in the timbre in the guitar tone. So those are some overall comparisons. It kind of reminds me in a roundabout way of that Lihamon band you put me on 2 years ago. Do you remember them?
Oh, you'd have to refresh my memory.
It's just really burly Diocletian style war metal from Germany. Much more sort of chug and heaviosity focused than this.
Oh, okay.
But it also there's a lot of mayhem in it. I think they may have literally been from Leipzig. But so this is another band I would compare this to for an overall feel would be Gospel of the Horns. That is, it has sort of it's thrashing, but it's not particularly fast, and it has more sort of heroic heavy metalisms in it. But it's not Destroyer 666, who are bad.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction here. Is we've gone back and forth on the what's war metal thing. I think that's kind of like well-trod territory. I'm not going to get into that, but I don't typically think of this as war metal because it's lacking a lot of that sort of like frantic off-the-cuff noisy quality. You know, whenever I hear war metal, I'm always thinking of, you know, Bestial, Warlust, Conqueror, that sort of thing, which I guess at this point might be sort of a fringe edge of it rather than the center of the style. Listening to Blood Serpent, this seems like certainly influenced by all the bands that they've stated, but really is rooted in a more traditional European style of black death metal. Certainly very aggressive and sort of deliberately ugly and playing with the sort of aesthetics of war metal, but remarkably composed and deliberate. And I think I know why. Because I think that what happens is, so this is a two-man project with programmed drums. That means that there isn't really an opportunity for those just chromatic blender riffs to just evolve naturally in a jam room. You know,
yeah.
Those totally dissonant, like, sliding chromatic things that you'll hear in Conqueror or Blasphemy, you can't really do that hanging out with your buddy trying to write music together.
Right, you have to have a drummer who's making a fucking din, and then you play this kind of like atonal, arrhythmic riff over it.
Yeah, sort of like, remember when we talked about Devourment molesting the decapitated and how some of those grind riffs aren't really riffs? He's just sort of doing slides within a handful of frets, and he's sort of landing on something. That's what a lot of war metal riffs are like, but you can't really do that in a non-live band environment. So what you get instead is something a little bit closer to, I would actually compare this to some of the more melodic moments of Amputator. You remember when we reviewed them for a bonus episode one time?
Amputator. Wait.
Yeah, we reviewed Death Cult Barbaric Hell. It was a patron request. It was American sort of like war black thrash stuff.
Oh, God, yes. Way back in the day.
Yeah, that was a very early one we did. Yeah, so Blood Serpent reminds me of that a little bit, but maybe even more sort of put together and composed here. And probably this has a lot to do with a lot of the melodic Swedish Black Death stuff that you're really invested in, just taken in a darker and more aggressive direction. I think this record's a lot of fun. Before we got on, I said that, you know, there's blessings and curses associated with the technology of any era of music, and this one is a blessing because, you know, without the internet, you don't get a couple young guys in Vietnam making something like this. It would just be too hard to get all the constituent elements together, but with access to the internet, it's now a possibility to find all this stuff and to immediately just, like, off the rip create something as, like, refined and coherent and imaginative as this is. And I think that's really cool.
There's a huge native war metal scene in Southeast Asia, but like it's like impiety and stuff like that, right? Which is much more like, you know, sadistic goat fucker type stuff. And the fact that this does not sound like that is I can see what you mean. It's a testament to the internet.
Well, I would say that even in Piety's later stuff, because we covered the what I think is the last Impiety record on probably like the second or third episode we ever did of the show. And I think Impiety is one of those bands that suggests sadistic goat fucker a little bit more than it actually executes. Because remember listening to it back in the day, and really Impiety in general is like presents itself as, you know, thermonuclear goat fucker stuff, but it's actually like pretty refined and composed music. You know, it's invested in very articulate melodies and right hand work.
You know, it's actually closer to Angel. What it's close to is Angel Corpse. Mm-hmm. That is, it's Morbid Angel with some more of the melodic color.
Yeah, there's a little bit of Melodeath sneaks in.
Yeah, so maybe in some way this is very faithful to that Southeast Asian strand. You could also throw in there Surrender of Divinity, who are, technically speaking, just a down-the-line black metal band, but are pretty gorked in a war metal way. Mm-hmm. But anyway, let's get to the title track, Bestial Extermination, and we will. Everything I want to say about it, I'll say after we played it. That's so. We get this. You could hear the Euronymous solo, right?
Yeah.
Just nobody.
Very, very live in Leipzig.
Yeah, we've mentioned this. Maybe, like, we've maybe heard someone pull off something. Oh yeah, who's the person? It's the band from Canada. Basically, nailing a Euronymous-influenced guitar style is almost impossible. Nobody bothers doing it, also.
Sorgwen
Sorgwen, right?
Yeah.
Had this really thorough understanding of the most unhinged side of the Euronymous style. And this is the only other... Blood Serpent is the only other band I've heard that has a similar understanding of what was cool about Euronymous as a lead guitarist and as a guitarist in general. It also has a bespoke riff under the solo.
Always good.
And the riff has, as you say, yes, it's got the sort of Swedish Black Death in it, maybe stuff like Necrophobic, which is probably flowing over here from Elcrost. But it also, there's an ear to the note choice there, to the more Aeolian, sort of noble-sounding riffing that really just sounds like Euronymous' ear for those intervals. Where there's still some connection to death metal, and it's the thing that they get about the Euron. Well, I'll talk about it more on the last one. I think the next one, it's my last sample is even more prominent. But it's got this awesome solo. The other thing I want to highlight, middle of the song, has this right? I mean, that's almost Rain and Blood. But it's got this it could just be locked in over a driving thrash beat, but that only happens for 20 seconds. Instead, it's this dropout part that merges into the beat, and then the beat drops away again. And it works as kind of this chrysalis for the song to metamorphose. There's some sort of like redirection of momentum that happens there that is very cool, and I would say mature, except older musicians often don't bother to do shit like that.
Well, I think that what's happening is there's sort of related to what I was saying, that these are two guys trying to create something that's kind of like chaotic war metal. So special care has been given to do very weird stuff with the drum programming, with the, I believe the intent being to simulate some of the sort of off-the-cuff weirdness of a lot of war metal drumming, but because it's programmed, it ends up coming off very differently. Just because, like, these are not sparsely programmed, but not especially humanized programmed drums. So a lot of the strange stop-start stuff that happens doesn't come off with these sort of organic, flick of the wrist touch that a human doing it would. So things tend to have a more lurching industrial feel, giving these moments that are supposed to sound sort of unhinged and weird, a definitely weird and alienating quality, but not maybe the same one that was intended, which is kind of unique.
It also, because they're playing to the drum, the drum machine, it means that there's a kind of locked-in classic heaviness that you don't get from a war metal band, where you're kind of just like in a vacuum that wants to kill you. This is, so a great example of that is the end of that. You get the blasting solo with the sort of gothic riffing underneath, and then just you just get this big galloping 6/8 thing, and you can headbang to it. Throughout this record, there's a concern for headbanging, and parts like that remind me of another band we haven't mentioned, Noir.
Yeah.
Like, there's a big... I sort of poo-pooed that stuff for a while, but I went back to it on Damian Master's recommendation, and I actually really... I liked it back in the day. I still like it. It's... there's this kind of... a nastier, less retro chic take on black thrash, basically, that has a lot of these kinds of big... sort of slanging and banging headbanging parts. So anyway, that's a characteristic. They never miss a chance. Blood Serpent never miss a chance for headbanging.
Yeah, and that's definitely going to be part of my first sample. So I want to go to Wielder of Pestilent Flame, which is probably my favorite track on the record. I think the most interesting thing about Blood Serpent to me is whether intentionally or just as a result of trying to do war metal in sort of a format inappropriate for it, two men with a drum machine, there's a lot of stuff on this record that sounds very attached to, like, traditional heavy metal to me. There's a lot of trad stuff. There's a lot of like early, like pre-1986 thrash stuff. And on Wielder of Pestilent Flame, we're going to start a couple minutes into the song. We're actually going to get to a section that just sounds like sort of a very old school first 3 albums Bathory section, including the holdover bluesy Motorhead bass line that, you know, would be all but kinds of techniques that would be all but expunged from extreme metal by 1989. So I'm curious, and I'll have to ask the guys about this. You know, were these deliberate callbacks to this era, or is this the result of like trying to meticulously recreate original war metal stuff, but as a result of the relative lack of chaos and clatter, these ideas just come through much more directly than they would otherwise? So everything that we hear in that sample, outside of, you know, the really aggressive blasting stuff, is really attainable for Bathory on the return. And yeah. I think that's super interesting to hear on a record like this. And this isn't the only moment. This is probably the biggest and most obvious and extended moment like that on this record. But a lot of the other songs are dotted with stuff like this that call back to, like, from 85 to 87. And certain elements, like that awesome bass lick that keeps popping up, that little dun-dun-dun-dun-dun phrase, that's straight out of the NWO BHM playbook that was still playing with a lot of that bluesy boogie rock stuff that, again, was out of metal by the late 80s. So, again, I want to ask that question, is this a deliberate first-hand influence on this music, or is this something that happens in the attempt to recreate something that Blasphemy does, but without all the clatter? This is what results. You know, you're sort of seeing the underlying framework of some of that primordial war metal stuff laid bare.
That it just sounds way more like Bathory than we realized.
Yeah, that, like, strip out all the excess distortion and the constant blast beats and the not being able to play in time, is a lot of it just Bathory at the end of the day?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. It feels pretty different. The sort of, like, swinging mid-tempo pace seems pretty different from a Blasphemy song, but they have slower parts, but they don't really work like this, do they?
Oh, well, I mean, Blasphemy is a catch-all for the whole early war metal sound. Mm-hmm. You know, in general, is what we are hearing when we listen to early war metal are we really hearing something different from the rest of early extreme metal, or are we hearing the production?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So I think that's curious, and that's something on this record that I really appreciate, are all these nods to sort of traditional styles of heavy metal, and I think in a lot of ways that this record is actually sticking the landing on a lot of stuff that bands like, I don't know, like fucking Midnight attempt to, which is this fusion of sort of what.
Oh, no, I was going to agree with you.
Oh, yeah, like this fusion of like modern extreme metal aesthetics and mid-'80s songwriting chops. I think this is a more like realistic take on that stuff rather than that sort of like artificial nostalgia pastiche that we're hearing in a lot of bands.
Midnight is a great example of artificial nostalgia pastiche. All those sort of goat bands, right? Like,
Midnight fucking sucks.
Yeah, Midnight's so boring. Oh my god.
I run into people. Oh, go ahead.
I saw them open for the Black Dahlia murder, and of course, Black Dahlia wiped them out. You know, just
every time somebody talks about Midnight, I'm just like, have you heard fucking Abigail? Have you heard Abigail? Because they've been doing what Midnight's doing for like 30 years.
Midnight. There's a whole bunch of other bands like that are sort of like chic leather jacket with a Bathory goat patch on it. It's that stuff is lame. So and that's one reason the sort of first wave type stuff gets a bad rap because of those bands, or at least gets a bad rap from us. But this is a very different way of doing it. You know, Noir did it differently. I mean, when I was saying, oh, they're a better take on this black thrash style, I was thinking of Than Midnight. But the another one that I just thought of, based on what you were saying, is like, does this sound like fucking Goat Whore?
It kind of in places. Goat Whore at this point is a band that's like operated so long in their peculiar songwriting niche, nobody really sounds like them. No. But I get what you mean, and as far as like the synthesis of extreme metal and like older hard rock and trad metal ideas go, definitely.
The blasting parts in Goat Whore are very kind of war metal-y, and then they have the really burly low end blasting, and then they have sort of various kinds of galloping thrash beats. And so it's sort of it's weird. It's reminding me of these like heavy aggressive thrashing Black Death stuff from the early 2000s that has been totally forgotten.
Yeah. This is a record that rediscovers a lot of cool dead ends that maybe weren't dead ends at all. Let me get to another one. This is Blood Defilement. And this one's a little bit more straightforward and like down the middle war metal, but the riffing is really interesting, and the primary riff here might be my favorite on the record. It's a super weird hybrid riff with like a Panzer Division Marduk front half and like a Tampa death metal trem riff back half. Super weird. But I think that it goes to telling you a lot about where this band's priorities are in terms of songwriting, and we'll get into it in a little bit. love that riff. I love all the grinding power chord stuff and that sudden twist into that that very asymptote or cryptopsy kind of phrasing, and cryptopsy is a lot that's derived from asymptote anyway. Proving once again the thing that it took everybody, I think it's established now, but it took so many years for everybody to realize that the legacy of Tampa is Morbid Angel, like 30 paces in front of basically every other band. Yeah. Asymptote's guitar style is still the most important thing that the Tampa death metal scene ever produced, and it's like not even a fucking question. Other good bands are out there, sure, but as far as like what mattered technologically, it was all in the hands of Trey Asymptote, our favorite professional drinker. So I think that what is happening on this record is a songwriting technique that we've talked about plenty on the show, which is about how if you want to sound like a band or a style, you don't listen to that style, you listen to the constituent influences that made that style or band. I think that Blood Serpent, in their effort to sound like war metal, have gone back and listened to all the things that fed into war metal. Stuff like very early Morbid Angel, very early black metal, primitive mayhem stuff and Bathory, a whole host of early black and death metal, as well as a lot of holdover thrash and heavy metal stuff that have basically been forgotten from the equation. And what has come out of all that research process is their own take on war metal that does not merely sound like every other war metal band, because anybody who listens to that pantheon of influences will take different things away from it and have different points of emphasis based on their own personal taste. Which is why, if you try to make a band that sounds like Revenge, it's going to fucking suck. But if you listen to all the things that Revenge listened to, you're going to come out with something that doesn't sound like Revenge, but is actually good.
And meets the jaws, the sacred heavens slip through the power of God's will, of God's grace, through the grasp of hell, through these leaps of rage. Like metal jaw, in a fierce grin. Black metal joy, grinds like a saw. Resistance of this, of a burning rust, a seeming raw, breathing in lust, clears from afar like a red death, in strange streets, in foul haze. Like a vulture in your soul's birth, it plunges deep in erratic speed through narrow earth. It swallows the sword into the claws of Satan's breed.